Chapter 1. The Conversations That Always Broke. The Carter family's dinner table was made of thick mahogany wood, polished to a near-mirror shine. Every evening, they sat around it like clockwork, Margaret at the far end, Ethan on one side, and Richard at the head. The food was always hot, the silence even hotter. Ethan toyed with the roasted carrots on his plate. The clinking of his fork was the only sound in the room until Richard finally spoke, voice firm as ever. "So, Ethan," he began, not looking up from his steak, "you graduate in 3 months. We'll bring you into the firm in July. I've already cleared it with Thompson to have you shadow acquisitions first. You'll get a feel for the bigger deals." Ethan's hand froze midair. The moment had arrived. He had played this scene in his mind countless times. Except now, seated at the real table. With the real weight of his father's words crashing down like bricks, his throat tightened. "I'm not joining the company, Dad." Richard's knife stopped slicing. His eyes lifted, steely and unreadable. "Excuse me." Ethan glanced briefly at his mother, who quickly looked down at her plate. She always did that, became invisible when things turned uncomfortable. He took a breath. "I'm applying to the Academy of Fine Arts in Paris. I've already submitted my portfolio." Silence. Then a slow, bitter chuckle. "Paris," Richard repeated, shaking his head. "You want to throw away a Harvard economics degree to chase crayons? They're oil paints," Ethan replied, voice sharper than intended. Richard leaned back in his chair. "You think life is a canvas, Ethan? That the world will clap because you know how to sketch a mountain or paint a bowl of fruit? It's not about that," Ethan snapped. "It's about telling stories. Feeling something. Creating something that outlives us." Richard's face hardened. "You have a legacy already. Your last name is on half the buildings in Boston. I don't want those buildings." Ethan stood now, heat rising to his face. "I never asked for any of this. I've done everything you asked. I got the grades, wore the suits, sat through every company dinner pretending to be someone I'm not. But this art is mine." Margaret stood quickly. "Boys, please, not like this." But it was too late. Richard rose too, pushing his chair back with a screech. "You want to know what real life is, Ethan? It's blood, deadlines, risk, not some fantasy painted on a canvas. You're living in a dream. And dreams don't pay rent. I'd rather struggle for something I love than succeed at something that kills me inside." His father's hands clenched. "You're ungrateful." Ethan's voice broke. "No. I'm just done being your reflection." Richard stared at him, lips pressed into a thin, cold line. "Then leave." The words hit harder than any slap could. Ethan looked at his mother, pleading. But she only held her hand to her lips. "I am leaving," Ethan said quietly. "I booked my flight to Paris for June." And with that, he walked out of the dining room, footsteps echoing through the marble hallway of their Beacon Hill home. Later that night, Ethan sat in the attic, staring at his old sketchbooks stacked in a corner. Pages crinkled with time, margins smudged with childhood dreams, pirates, birds, cityscapes, a sketch of a father's hand holding a boy's. He didn't remember drawing that one, but the signature in the corner was his. He gently tore it out. Packing would begin tomorrow. Downstairs, Richard stood in the doorway of the now empty dining room, a glass of whiskey in hand, untouched. He looked over to the family photo on the sideboard, one from Ethan's high school graduation. Ethan was smiling in the photo, but not at the camera, at his mother, who held one of his paintings like it was treasure. Richard walked past it and into his study. He opened the bottom drawer of the cabinet, the one Ethan never knew existed. Inside were piles of papers, business documents, reports, and a folder labeled EC Art. He pulled it out. Inside were dozens of small drawings Ethan had made as a child, paper lions, watercolored trees, a card that read, "To Dad, the strongest man in the world." Richard closed the folder, pressed it against his chest for a moment, and sat down in the darkness. He had never known how to speak Ethan's language. And now, his son was leaving for good. Chapter 2. The Rejected Choice. The airport was quiet that morning, but Ethan's heart was anything but. He clutched his passport in one hand and the strap of his backpack in the other. His sketchbook, dog-eared and stained with coffee, dreams, and desperation, was tucked safely inside. His suitcase trailed behind him like a reluctant companion, heavy with just enough clothes to start over. There had been no goodbye, no hug from his mother, no last-minute gesture from his father. Just silence. Silence so loud, it rang in his ears even as the intercom announced his gate. He sat by the window and watched the planes take off, cutting through the clouds like they had a purpose. He tried to picture himself among them, fearless, weightless, free. But the ache in his chest betrayed him. A boy next to him, no older than 10, was coloring in a sketchpad. He used bold, uneven lines. The airplane he drew was lopsided, and his sky was neon green. But his eyes sparkled with joy. Ethan smiled and, for a moment, felt something settle in him. Something real. 3 weeks earlier, the application to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris had been sent without fanfare. Ethan had spent 2 months building his portfolio in secret, painting in the university library, scanning old works, photographing pieces he'd never dared show anyone. He remembered the night he got the email. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter. You've been accepted into our fall cohort." He had cried in his car. Not because he was afraid or even excited, but because, for the first time, something that felt entirely his was coming true. No shadows of his father's empire. No Carter and Sons. Just Ethan. Just color. Just breath. Richard Carter stared at the chair across from him in his office. It had been Ethan's seat once, when he was younger, when he still believed his son would someday take over the firm. He had once imagined walking into a boardroom with Ethan at his side, talking strategy, profits, legacy. Now, the chair was empty. He picked up the phone and dialed Margaret. She answered on the second ring. "Yes." "Did he leave yet?" Richard asked. Her sigh was quiet, but sharp. "He's at the airport. Gate B4. His flight boards in 40 minutes. "I see." She hesitated. "You could still go, Richard." "To what end?" he murmured. "To tell him again how wrong he is?" "No. To listen. Maybe for once, that's what he needs." Richard didn't respond. The line went quiet. And then click. At the airport, Ethan checked his phone again. No missed calls. No texts. Just a message from Jamie. "You better come back with scandalous French art stories and a beret. I'm holding your room hostage." He laughed despite himself. Then the gate attendant called for boarding. People gathered their things, shuffling into line. Ethan hesitated. A small voice inside him said, "Maybe wait 5 more minutes. Maybe he'll come." But the hallway stayed empty. The father-shaped void did not fill. He walked forward, ticket in hand. Paris was colder than he expected. His dorm was a 6th-floor walk-up in the 11th arrondissement, with cracked walls and an ever-leaking radiator. But the studio on the roof had skylight windows. And when the afternoon sun poured in, it made every brushstroke glow. His French was clumsy. His grocery budget tighter than a canvas on a frame. But every night, he painted until his fingers cramped. And he breathed. He sent 1 email to his mother every Sunday. Never got a reply, only read receipts. He never emailed his father. 6 months passed. His professors praised his use of emotion and texture. His classmates said his paintings always looked like someone was about to speak in them, but never quite did. He took it as a compliment. He knew what it meant to live surrounded by silence. Back in Boston, Richard found himself pausing more often by Ethan's old bedroom. The door was always closed. But he could still smell the faint scent of paint, acrylic, and turpentine. He had begun attending gallery events in the city. Quietly. Alone. Observing the art world like a tourist. Not speaking. Not touching. He never stayed long. But he was always looking for something. One night, in the attic, Richard stumbled across an old box marked Ethan, age 7. Inside, among the birthday cards and elementary school awards, was a drawing of the Carter family. He, Margaret, and Ethan, holding hands. But Richard's figure was drawn with a briefcase instead of hands. And his eyes were tiny dots. No pupils. Underneath it, in shaky handwriting, Ethan had written, Dad works a lot. I miss him. Richard sat there for a long time. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried since his father died. But something inside him cracked quietly, like ice beneath the weight of too many winters. Chapter 3. The day he left. It was raining in Boston the day Ethan left. Not the kind of rain that made the world feel fresh and romantic, but cold. Bone-soaking drizzle that turned sidewalks into mirrors and skies into dull metal sheets. It had started just after dawn, as if the weather itself knew what kind of goodbye this was meant to be. Ethan stood in the foyer of their Beacon Hill brownstone, dressed in a navy coat with a scarf Margaret had quietly folded into his suitcase the night before. His sketchbook was tucked under his arm, worn from years of fingerprints and ink stains. The suitcase by his feet carried only what was necessary: paints, clothes, a second pair of shoes, and 2 letters, one addressed to his mother, and one to no one in particular. He had written it for his father. But the envelope remained blank. The hallways smelled faintly of wood polish and lemon oil. The grandfather clock ticked down the last few minutes before the cab would arrive. The sound used to soothe him as a child. Now it just reminded him of all the things that had been said too late or never said at all. Margaret hovered near the staircase, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea she didn't drink. She looked tired, but her eyes were wide and wet, darting from Ethan's face to the front door as if any moment now it might open and Richard would come down, changed. But the stairs remained silent. "He's not coming, is he?" Ethan asked, voice low. Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. "He stayed late at the office last night." Ethan gave a short laugh, dry, bitter. "Of course he did." "Ethan," she said, setting the cup down, "he doesn't know how to say it, but he loves you. He only knows how to measure life in results. In outcomes. That's what his father taught him." "And what did you teach me, Mom?" Ethan asked, softer now. She reached up and smoothed his hair, like she used to do when he was small and frightened of thunderstorms. "I hope I taught you that your feelings are not a weakness." The cab honked outside. Ethan bent down, zipped his coat, and took the handle of his suitcase. "You'll call me when you land?" Margaret asked quickly. "I will. And let me know how the classes go. The professors? The food? Everything." Ethan paused at the door, then turned back and pulled her into a hug. "I'll write. Every week." Margaret squeezed him tightly. Her voice broke as she whispered, "You've always been enough." No matter what he said or didn't say. He didn't reply. He couldn't. His throat was full. He opened the door. Outside, the cab driver popped the trunk. The city was soaked in gray, the cobblestones slippery beneath Ethan's boots. He tossed the suitcase in and slid into the back seat without looking up at the house again. As the car pulled away, Margaret stood in the doorway, holding her coat closed against the wind. She didn't wave. She didn't cry. She simply watched him go, watched the cab turn the corner and vanish down the wet street like a dream dissolving in daylight. Upstairs, behind a closed office door, Richard stood motionless. He had heard everything, every word. He had risen early that morning, dressed in a crisp suit, and come downstairs silently, but instead of stepping into the foyer, he had turned left and closed himself inside his study. He watched Ethan leave through the small slit between the blinds, not because he was ashamed, but because he was afraid that if he opened that door, he wouldn't be able to let go. Afraid that his voice, hardened by years of orders and expectations, would fail him when it mattered most. There were words inside him. They just never made it out in time. Back in the cab, Ethan stared out the window as Boston receded behind him. Buildings blurred into one another. And the skyline, once a symbol of power and permanence, felt like a distant childhood memory. He pulled the sketchbook from his bag and opened to a blank page. He didn't draw a building. He didn't draw the house or the office or his father's face. Instead, he drew a small boy standing in a puddle, looking up at a sky too large for his hands. The boy held a brush. The clouds looked like unfinished thoughts. Beneath it, he wrote, "To the silence that raised me." Chapter 4. A Father Left Behind. The house was too quiet. Even the grandfather clock seemed hesitant now, ticking with long, reluctant pauses as if it, too, was adjusting to Ethan's absence. Richard stood in the doorway of Ethan's room, arms crossed, his frame rigid as if carved in stone. The room looked frozen in time, bed neatly made, bookshelf lined with old sketchbooks, walls bare except for a few pencil drawings pinned above the desk. One of them caught his eye. It was a charcoal sketch of a man sitting on a park bench. He wasn't doing anything extraordinary, just reading a newspaper, legs crossed, coat wrinkled. But the detail was haunting. The face was slightly turned away, obscured by shadows, and yet there was a tension in the posture, as if the man wanted to be somewhere else. Or perhaps, with someone else. Richard approached the drawing slowly. He reached up to take it off the wall but stopped himself, letting his fingers hover just short of the paper. He wasn't sure if it was meant to be him. And that uncertainty, piercing, raw, was worse than any confirmation. He walked back downstairs and made himself coffee he wouldn't drink. The clink of the spoon against the mug echoed in the kitchen like a hollow bell. Margaret sat at the breakfast nook, pretending to read. Her eyes were glazed, unfocused, barely moving across the page. "He's gone," Richard said. She didn't look up. "Yes, he'll be back." She flipped a page. "You're certain?" Richard didn't answer. Because he wasn't. Later that day, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He opened the attic. The air was thick with dust and memories. Boxes were stacked high and carelessly, labeled in Margaret's neat handwriting: holiday lights, Ethan, school, old books, and at the very back, a lone box with no label at all. He pulled it forward and opened the flaps. Inside were old drawings, hundreds of them. Some on school paper, others on napkins, scraps of envelopes, backs of receipts. Trains, animals, people with oversized eyes and strange hats. Many were childish and messy, but some were arresting. Emotional, unfiltered. At the very bottom, folded in half, was a card. "To Dad, when I grow up, I want to make things like you do." But with color. It was signed, Ethan, age 7. Richard sat down on the attic floor. He didn't cry. He just stared at that line, reading it again and again. The words pressing into his chest like invisible ink finally becoming visible. For the next few weeks, life returned to its rhythm, but now there was an echo in every room. Margaret moved through the house with practiced grace, making small talk, preparing meals, watering the plants. But Richard could feel the difference. She wasn't angry. She wasn't cold. She was quietly disappointed. And somehow, that was worse than all the shouting in the world. One evening, he came home from work later than usual. The office had been unusually silent without the usual storm of emails and meetings. The stock market had surged that day, and one of their commercial projects had secured funding. It was a good day. On paper. But when he came home, there was no one waiting. No clinking dishes. No news murmuring from the living room TV. Only the soft rustle of paper in the den. Margaret was sitting with a stack of letters. Richard paused at the doorway. "What are those?" She didn't look up. "Ethan's. He writes every week." He stepped closer. "And he sends them here?" "No. He sends them to me. At the shop's P.O. box. I didn't think you'd be interested." A beat passed. Then he said, "Can I read one?" She looked at him for a long time, as if trying to decide whether the man in front of her was capable of receiving what those letters held. At last, she handed him one near the middle of the stack. It was dated 2 weeks ago. "Dear Mom, today I painted for 8 hours straight. I lost all sense of time. It felt like breathing for the first time in years. The professor said something that stuck with me," he said. "The art that stays is the art that costs." I don't think he meant money. Sometimes I wonder what Dad would say if he saw what I painted today. Probably something like, "It won't sell." But still. I imagined showing him anyway. And that's progress, right? Wanting to show him again? "Love, Ethan." Richard read it twice, then folded it carefully and gave it back to Margaret. "I kept his drawings," he said after a long moment. "All of them." She didn't reply. She just stared down at the stack of letters, running her finger along their spines like they were fragile bones. "I never knew." She finally said, "What mattered more to you, his future or your name?" Richard turned toward the door. But before he left, he said, "I didn't either. Until now." That night, long after Margaret went to bed, Richard stood in the attic again. He placed all of Ethan's childhood drawings into a wooden box, one by one, carefully, as if they were holy. When he finished, he ran his hand along the top of the lid. He didn't know when he'd see his son again, but when he did, he would bring this box. Chapter 5: Paris and the Colors of Becoming. Paris was not the postcard Ethan had imagined. It was louder, messier, more chaotic, but also, strangely, more alive. The air smelled like cigarettes, rain, and fresh bread. The sidewalks buzzed with hurried footsteps and swirling snippets of conversation in a dozen accents. On his first day, Ethan stood outside the Académie des Beaux-Arts for nearly 20 minutes, staring up at the arched windows and stone columns like a boy about to walk into a cathedral. In many ways, he was. This place was sacred, not because of its prestige or history, but because it was the first place Ethan had chosen for himself. His dorm room was on the top floor of an old building in the 11th arrondissement. The staircase creaked, the radiator hissed like an angry cat, and the kitchen sink gurgled every time someone flushed on another floor. But it had a skylight, and through it, Ethan could see the sky change moods, clouds like brushstrokes smudged across blue. There was no space for nostalgia here. Every day demanded presence, assignments, lectures in rapid-fire French, deadlines, critiques. But Ethan welcomed the exhaustion. It meant he was building something not for his father's company, but for his own soul. In the studio, the air smelled of turpentine, sweat, and possibility. His professor, a wiry man with wild gray hair and a voice that always sounded on the edge of laughter, was named Clement. He never complimented outright, but Ethan had caught him pausing by his canvas once, eyes narrowing as he muttered, "There's grief in your palette. Keep it. That's real." Ethan didn't reply. He didn't need to. The canvas had already spoken for him. He made few friends at first. His French was clumsy, his accent too round, too American. But art was a language of its own. People began to recognize him by the way he layered shadow, by the emotion in his unfinished corners. And then came Jamie. Jamie Lynn was chaos in human form. Korean-American, born in New Jersey, raised in Lyon. With a tongue sharper than her eyeliner wing and a laugh that turned heads across any cafe. She had transferred from London to Paris for her thesis work in curatorial studies. On their first real conversation, she peered over his shoulder at one of his canvases, an abstract of a hand reaching toward a closed door, and said, "Your dad, right?" Ethan blinked. "What?" Jamie shrugged. "That's a father-shaped door. You're not the first artist with daddy issues, trust me." He had wanted to be offended. Instead, he burst out laughing. They'd been inseparable ever since. On weekends, they wandered Montmartre with sketchbooks and cheap coffee. They made fun of snooty gallery patrons. They watched street performers with paint on their hands. Ethan would sometimes stop in the middle of the street and stare at something, a shadow, a woman's posture, a pigeon on a ledge, and Jamie would pull out her camera and capture it. "You see feelings," she said one day, "even when they're trying to hide." Ethan didn't know how to respond, so he sketched her instead. But even in Paris, even in moments of joy, the ache returned at night. After midnight, when the city settled, Ethan would lie awake staring at the cracked ceiling. He thought about Boston, about the sound of his father's shoes in the hallway, about the conversation that never finished. And sometimes, on the loneliest nights, he imagined what it would be like to receive a letter, not from his mother, but from Richard Carter. Still, the silence stretched. Months passed. Until one day, Jamie burst into the dorm with a flyer in hand. Small gallery. Le Marais. Open call for new voices. 2-week group exhibit. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I'm not ready." Jamie tossed her coat on the chair. "Your work is. You? You'll never feel ready. That's the curse of having a soul." She made him apply. She dragged him to the gallery. She helped him select pieces. When they got the acceptance email, Jamie screamed louder than he did. That night, Ethan opened a blank page in his sketchbook and wrote a single sentence. "I wish he could see this." Then he closed the book, turned off the light, and let the darkness hold him, just for a while. Chapter 6. Jamie and the First Spark. The gallery in Le Marais was nothing like the grand white-walled institutions Ethan had grown up seeing in Boston. It was small, almost cramped, with exposed brick walls, crooked floorboards, and hanging lights that flickered with the mood of the wind outside. But it had heart. Every corner whispered stories. Not of perfection, but of passion. It felt right. Ethan and Jamie arrived 2 days before the show opened to help hang his pieces. There were 4 in total, each one chosen carefully. Each one soaked with pieces of himself he rarely showed even to her. She studied the first canvas, a pair of feet mid-step, the shadow of an open door just behind them. The title card read, "Departure." "This one still makes me hold my breath," Jamie whispered. "It's like the moment right before you break, beautiful, but terrifying." Ethan smiled faintly, adjusting the hanging wire. That's kind of what it was. She moved to the second, Inheritance, a split portrait. One side a boy holding a sketch pad, the other, a man with a briefcase. They were back to back, connected by a golden thread painted so delicately it looked like it could snap at any moment. "I don't even need to ask who this is about," Jamie said, more gently now. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. That night, as they left the gallery and stepped into the lamplight, Paris was quiet in the way only cities can be when everyone is eating late dinners and forgetting the time. Jamie kicked a pebble down the sidewalk as they walked. "Do you think he knows?" she asked. "Who?" "Your dad. That you're about to put your soul on a wall for strangers to examine." Ethan laughed bitterly. "He probably thinks I'm backpacking through Europe and sketching for fun." Jamie looked over at him, serious now. "You should tell him." "I don't even know where to start." "Start with the truth." Ethan didn't respond. Because the truth, at least the version that hurt the most, was that a part of him still wanted his father to be proud. Still wanted him to walk through the door, even just once, and say, "You did good, son." But maybe that was foolish. Maybe that door had already closed. The next day, they returned to the gallery for final checks. Other young artists were setting up, a sculpture made entirely of bike chains, a photography series of rooftops at dawn, a triptych of women with flame-colored hair and paper skin. It was an odd assortment, but it worked. Each piece spoke in its own tongue, and yet the room hummed with a common desire to be seen. Jamie busied herself with the event logistics, flitting between artists and the gallery manager like a windstorm with a clipboard. Ethan stood quietly by his paintings, touching up small imperfections with a practiced hand. When he finished, he stepped back and looked at Inheritance again. The boy and the man still didn't face each other. He reached for his brush, dipped it in a pale shade of blue, and added something small, a barely visible stroke connecting their eyes through the golden thread. Not a full gaze, just the hint of a glance. When Jamie returned, she noticed it instantly. "That wasn't there yesterday." "No," Ethan said. "But maybe it was always supposed to be." That evening, back in their tiny apartment, Jamie brought out a bottle of cheap wine and 2 chipped mugs. "To your first real exhibit," she said, raising hers. Ethan clinked his mug against hers. "To pretending we have money." They both laughed. Then, after a beat, Jamie added, "To the spark." Ethan looked over. "What spark?" "The one that got you here. The one that survived everything, expectations, silence, disappointment. That little fire you kept feeding in secret." He smiled, softer now. "I think you helped light it." She nudged his shoulder. "I just gave you kindling. You were already burning." Later that night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat by the skylight, legs crossed, sketchbook in his lap. The city outside was a blur of amber lights and faraway sounds. He flipped to a blank page. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't draw his father. He drew himself, standing in a gallery, alone, but not lonely. And behind him, just out of frame, a shadowy figure, undefined. Soft at the edges. Watching. Not approaching. Just present. Chapter 7. The Letters Never Sent. Ethan never meant to start writing them. It began one evening, after a particularly exhausting critique session at the studio. His professor had called his latest work technically strong but emotionally distant. It stung more than he expected. Back at the apartment, the city felt too loud. Even the soft hum of traffic through the cracked window scratched at his skin. He lit a candle, opened a notebook, and, without thinking, wrote at the top of the page, "Dear Dad." He stared at it for a long time. Then, slowly, he started writing. The first letter was short. Just a handful of lines. "You probably think I'm wasting my time. Maybe I am. But today, someone cried in front of my painting. Not because it was beautiful, because it reminded them of something they thought they forgot. I don't know if that means anything to you, but it meant everything to me." He didn't sign it. He didn't fold it. He just left it in the notebook. The second letter came a week later. Then the third. Before long, Ethan had an entire section of his sketchbook filled with unsent letters. Some were a single paragraph. Others spanned 3 or 4 pages, scratched out with smudged graphite and coffee stains. He wrote about things he couldn't say out loud, how he hated the silence after every phone call with Margaret, how he longed for approval he knew might never come, how he sometimes painted with tears in his eyes and didn't even realize until the colors blurred on the canvas. He wrote about how much he loved art, how much it scared him, how much it saved him, and most of all, how much he wished his father could see him, not as a failure or a disappointment, but as a person. A man. His son. Jamie found the notebook by accident one morning when she was searching for a clean page to jot down delivery dates for the gallery. She didn't mean to read the first line, but she did. And then the second. And the third. When Ethan walked into the room with coffee in hand, she was still sitting there, eyes glassy, the book open on her lap. He froze. "Jamie." She looked up slowly. "You should send these." He shook his head. They're not for him. They are. You just don't know it yet." Ethan set the coffee down. He wouldn't read them. Jamie closed the book carefully and handed it back to him. "Then write when he can." That night, Ethan tried. He sat by the window, candlelight flickering across the page, and wrote, "Dear Dad, my first gallery show is in 2 days. There's a seat in the front row with no name on it. I don't expect you to be in it. I just needed to leave it empty, in case you ever wanted to fill it. I'm not writing for an apology. I'm writing because every color I use still has your voice in the background, telling me it's not enough. I've painted you in shadows, in storms, in silence. Maybe someday I'll learn how to paint forgiveness." He stared at the last sentence for a long time. Then he tore the page out, folded it neatly, and slipped it into an envelope. He addressed it. Richard Carter. Carter and Company. Beacon Hill, Boston, Massachusetts. He didn't know if he would send it, but it was the first letter that felt like it could. The next morning, Ethan went out early. He walked to the nearest mailbox with the letter in his pocket. Paris was still waking up, street sweepers humming, bakery doors cracking open with warm light and the smell of butter. He stood in front of the red postbox for 10 full minutes. Then, with a breath that trembled in his chest, he let the envelope slide from his fingers. It disappeared into the dark. Back in Boston, Richard sat in his office, staring out at the skyline. The morning light poured across the glass table in golden angles, and the city looked sharp and endless. His assistant knocked once and stepped in. "Mail from the U.S. branch, sir." He nodded distractedly. The stack of mail was mostly contracts and catalogs. Until he saw it. Handwritten. No return address. No business logo. He turned it over once. Paused. And carefully opened it. Chapter 8, Dreams and Unfinished Things. Richard Carter had read the letter 3 times. It was now spread flat on his mahogany desk, flanked by untouched paperwork and a steaming cup of black coffee slowly going cold. There were no accusations in the letter. No dramatic pleas. Just a quiet kind of ache. A tenderness laced with distance. It was a son trying to reach his father, Not to blame, but to be seen. And it unsettled Richard more than anger ever could. He carried the letter in his inner coat pocket all day. Into board meetings. Through client calls. Even to lunch, where the VP of Acquisitions rambled on about quarterly growth. The words echoed in his mind. I just needed to leave it empty, in case you ever wanted to fill it. That line was a mirror. And Richard didn't quite recognize the reflection it offered. At home that evening, Margaret noticed the shift immediately. She set the casserole on the table and watched as Richard silently placed his jacket over the chair. He didn't pour his usual scotch. Didn't turn on the news. Instead, he stood at the dining room window, watching the last of the autumn leaves swirl in the wind. Something happened today? She asked softly. He turned to her slowly, then reached into his pocket and handed her the folded letter. She read it once, then held it against her chest as if it were something fragile. When she finally looked at him, her voice cracked. He invited you. Richard looked away. I'm not sure I deserve it. Margaret stepped forward, eyes full of something between grief and hope. Deserve doesn't matter now. Love isn't about merit. It's about moments. And you still have one. Across the ocean, in Paris, Ethan was up late again. The gallery show was less than 24 hours away, and his nerves buzzed like static in his fingertips. He had checked and rechecked his canvases, adjusted the lighting, rewritten his artist statement 3 times. Still, he couldn't sleep. Jamie walked in, holding 2 mugs of cocoa. I figured coffee would be a mistake. He took the mug gratefully. Thanks. You okay? He nodded, then shrugged. I just feel like something's missing. Like I'm proud, but not whole. Jamie sat beside him on the window ledge. That's grief. Ethan looked over, surprised. You think I'm grieving? You're mourning the version of him you hoped he'd be. The one that would have understood without needing a letter. Ethan swallowed hard. Yeah, maybe. Jamie nudged his shoulder. But you still sent the letter. That matters. He looked at her for a moment. You think he'll come? I think he read it. And I think that changes things whether he gets on a plane or not. The next morning, the gallery buzzed with early energy. Other artists arrived in small groups, adjusting frames, smoothing over nerves. Jamie handled logistics with fierce efficiency, crossing names off guest lists, confirming media presence, checking refreshments. Ethan stood in front of Inheritance, smoothing invisible wrinkles in the canvas. This was the piece he feared the most. The one that held too much. Said too much. He glanced at the front row of chairs. One of them was marked with a small white card. Reserved. Not for anyone specific. Just reserved. Just in case. As the doors opened, people trickled in. Professors, students, locals, tourists with curious eyes. The gallery filled with murmurs, camera flashes, clinking glasses. Ethan shook hands. Answered questions. Smiled when he needed to. But every 10 minutes, his eyes flicked to that front row. Still empty. Back in Boston, Richard Carter stood in front of a mirror, adjusting the collar of a travel-worn overcoat. His flight to Paris left in 4 hours. The wooden box sat beside his suitcase. Inside were Ethan's childhood drawings, each one wrapped in soft tissue paper. Every line, every crayon smudge preserved. He ran his hand across the lid, then looked down at the folded plane ticket on the table. He wasn't a man who made spontaneous decisions. But this wasn't about spontaneity. It was about a door his son had left ajar. And this time, he was going to walk through it. Chapter 9. The Light Above the Canvas. The gallery lights had a strange way of turning everything quiet. Ethan stood still amid the noise, the footsteps, the laughter, the hum of conversation in half a dozen languages, and yet it all faded into a low thrum beneath the spotlight that glowed softly above his painting. Inheritance. It looked different today. Maybe it was the lighting. Maybe it was the air. Or maybe, finally, he was starting to see it the way it was always meant to be seen, not just a memory, but a mirror. Someone approached from behind, pausing next to him. She's strong, said a woman in French, gesturing at the female figure in the absence, another of Ethan's paintings, the one of the mother reaching toward an empty chair. Is it your mother? She asked. Ethan nodded. Part of her. The woman smiled, gave a small nod, and moved on. Jamie appeared at his side with a half-eaten croissant in one hand and a stack of folded programs in the other. You're officially the crowd favorite. And possibly the next tortured genius Paris will claim as its own. He gave her a look. Tortured. She smirked. You haven't blinked in 10 minutes. I'm waiting for someone. Her expression softened. Still holding out? Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at the chair in the front row. Still empty, but somehow heavier than before. Back at Charles de Gaulle Airport, Richard Carter stepped through customs with a passport in one hand and a sense of disorientation clinging to his coat like fog. He hadn't traveled internationally in over a decade. The flight had been long, the language unfamiliar, and the streets outside the airport too narrow for his Boston-trained instincts. But he carried the wooden box like a lifeline held tight, never letting it out of his sight. His cab driver asked, in thickly accented English, "You visit family?" Richard hesitated, then replied, "I'm trying." Jamie slipped Ethan a note near the refreshment table. "Walk outside. Breathe. You're vibrating." He took her advice. Out on the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the cobblestones. Paris was humming its usual tune, buses rolling by, couples strolling, someone strumming a guitar across the street. Ethan leaned against the gallery's stone wall and closed his eyes. He didn't hear footsteps, but he felt the shift in the air. When he opened his eyes, Richard was there. They stared at each other for a long moment, two men, bound by blood and distance, standing with a country between them and more years of silence than either could count. Ethan opened his mouth, but nothing came. Richard held up the box. He didn't speak either, just offered it. Ethan blinked. "What's that?" Richard stepped closer. "I kept them." He handed it over. The weight was surprising. Ethan sat down on the low stone edge near the entrance and slowly opened the box. Inside, neatly preserved, were drawings he hadn't seen in decades, crayon houses, messy watercolor suns. A drawing of a man in a blue suit holding hands with a boy holding a paintbrush. He reached for one with trembling fingers. "You kept these?" Ethan asked, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how to tell you I was proud," Richard said. "So I kept the only parts of you I understood." Ethan looked up. His eyes were wet. "Why no?" "Because," Richard said, sitting beside him, "you left a chair for me. I couldn't not show up." They sat in silence, the kind that didn't hurt this time. Inside the gallery, the lights continued to shine, and the visitors moved through the room without noticing the moment unfolding just outside the door. Eventually, Ethan reached into the box, pulled out the folded drawing of the two figures, and handed it to his father. "Do you remember this one?" he asked. Richard took it, holding it like something fragile. "I used to keep it in my desk." Ethan smiled, tears slipping down his cheek. Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder, not heavy, not demanding. "Just there. I'm here now," he said. "And I want to see what you've made." Together, they stood and walked inside. Chapter 10. The Canvas That Knew His Name. The gallery door swung open with a quiet chime as Ethan and Richard stepped inside together. The moment was unremarkable to everyone else. Guests glanced over briefly, then returned to the artwork or the wine or their soft conversations. But for Ethan, the world seemed to hold its breath. His father was here. Not in memory. Not in theory. In person. Richard's eyes swept the room slowly. There were no suits in here, no marble floors or boardroom tables. Just wood, paint, color, and stories hanging on walls. Stories his son had painted. Stories he had once refused to hear. Ethan guided him toward the center display. The crowd naturally gave them space, parting with quiet curiosity. A few of Ethan's classmates watched from the far end, whispering to each other, perhaps realizing what was unfolding before them. Richard stopped in front of Inheritance. It was taller than he expected, rich in deep reds and cold blues. One side of the canvas held the image of a boy with a paintbrush, the other, a man in a suit holding a briefcase. Their bodies turned away from each other, yet connected by a fragile golden thread running diagonally through the painting. Richard leaned forward. The thread, he hadn't noticed it in the letter. But here, in person, it shimmered slightly under the gallery lights. And in the eyes of the two figures, tiny brushstrokes indicated a subtle shift. They weren't looking away. Not fully. They were beginning to turn. "This is the one," Ethan said quietly. "The painting I almost didn't show." Richard didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, hands behind his back. The way he always stood when inspecting a new building site. Except now, instead of concrete, he was staring into pigment and pain. "I saw this version of us so many times," Ethan admitted. "Even when I was little." Richard nodded. "So did I. I just couldn't face it." There was a pause. Then Richard said, "But you didn't paint hate into it." Ethan turned, surprised. "You painted longing. And distance. But not hate." Ethan's voice was hoarse. "Because I never hated you. I just needed you to see me." Richard finally looked at him, and this time really looked. "I see you now." They moved on to departure, the piece with the feet mid-step, the door cracked open in the background. Richard stood in front of it for a long time. "I remember this moment," he said. Ethan blinked. "You do?" "That night you left. I heard the door close and I almost called your name." His voice cracked slightly. "But I didn't. I thought if I stopped you, you'd resent me even more. You already thought I hated you." "Yes." Richard looked away. "And I didn't know how to ask if it was true." Ethan exhaled. "It wasn't. It never was." They both stood in silence, not needing to say anything more. Jamie appeared a few minutes later, gently approaching with a smile. "Hi, Mr. Carter." Richard blinked. "You must be Jamie. I've heard a lot about you," she said, extending her hand. He shook it. "I imagine not all of it flattering." She smirked. "Well, you're here. That's what matters." Then she leaned toward Ethan, whispered in his ear, "You okay?" Ethan nodded. "I think I am." As the crowd began to thin and evening light faded beyond the gallery windows, Ethan walked back to the reserved chair in the front row, the one he had left empty on purpose. He pulled the small white card from its seat and held it in his hands. Then, gently, he walked to inheritance, took a bit of tape from his pocket, and stuck the card to the bottom edge of the frame. On it, he wrote 2 words in clean, simple handwriting. "For Dad." Later that night, after the guests had gone and the last wine glass had been washed, Richard and Ethan stood by the gallery door. The wooden box, Ethan's childhood artwork, sat safely beside the desk, waiting to be taken home. "I was never good at words," Richard said softly. Ethan smiled. "You didn't need them tonight." Richard looked at his son. "So, what now?" Ethan glanced around the quiet gallery, then back at his father. "Now," he said, "we begin." Chapter 11. The Box of Memory. The box sat unopened on the kitchen table of Ethan's apartment the next morning. Its wooden frame was scuffed with age, the brass hinges slightly tarnished. But the way his father had carried it, carefully, reverently, made it feel like something sacred. It wasn't big. It could easily be mistaken for a container of family recipes or old photographs. But Ethan knew what was inside, and that was why he hadn't opened it yet. The apartment was still and golden in the early light. Outside, the streets of Paris were already waking, but inside, everything held its breath. Ethan stood over the box with a mug of coffee in hand, heart thudding against his ribs. Jamie wandered in from the bedroom in one of his oversized shirts, stretching and yawning. "You didn't sleep, did you?" He shook his head. "Not really." Her eyes dropped to the box. "Still unopened?" "I don't know if I'm ready." Jamie padded over barefoot and sat across from him. "Your father flew across the ocean to give it to you. Whatever's in there. I think he's been carrying it longer than just in his hands." Ethan traced the brass latch with his thumb. Then, slowly, he lifted the lid. Inside were layers of childhood preserved with the care of a man who could never say the words. Drawings Ethan didn't remember making, sketches of dragons and planets, stick figures with speech bubbles, a tree with roots that reached down into a volcano. Some were folded, Some crumpled and flattened again, but all of them were undeniably his. And beneath those, there were framed prints. Photocopies of his middle school art projects. Even a report card with a starred A in visual arts circled in red. On the back, in faint pencil, someone, his father, it had to be, had written, "He always sees what others miss." Ethan's hand trembled as he touched the corner of that paper. I had no idea he kept any of this. Jamie leaned in, her voice hushed. This is his way of saying he saw you, even when he didn't know how to show it. At the very bottom of the box lay a sealed envelope. It wasn't labeled. Just thick ivory paper and a wax seal that looked slightly cracked from age. Ethan picked it up. You think it's a letter? Jamie gave a small smile. Only one way to find out. He opened it carefully, pulling out a single sheet of lined paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Richard's, sharp, formal, like every letter had been measured before it touched the page. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I've finally done what I should have done years ago, shown up. I don't know how to speak your language, son. I never learned how. My father only taught me numbers and blueprints and how to build empires. But you taught yourself how to build meaning. I used to find your drawings scattered around the house. At first, I tucked them away so your mother wouldn't think I was encouraging you. But truthfully, I kept them because I didn't want to lose them. I didn't want to lose you. I've made a lot of mistakes. But not recognizing your talent, your soul, was the worst of them. The world is better because of the way you see it. I know that now. And I want to learn. From you. Dad. Ethan read the letter twice. Then a third time. By the end, his tears had spilled onto the page, smudging the word learn. Jamie reached out and held his hand across the table. You okay? I think. Ethan said through a breath, for the first time in my life, I actually am. Later that day, they brought the box to the gallery. Jamie had already spoken to the curator. We're adding a new installation, she said as they walked in. Something quiet. Something true. In a glass case near inheritance. They displayed 3 of Ethan's childhood drawings and a copy of Richard's letter. On a small card next to them, Ethan wrote, Before I was seen, I was saved by a father who couldn't speak in color, but who kept every shade I left behind. When Richard visited the gallery again later that week, he stood in front of the display for a long, long time. He didn't say a word. But this time, he didn't need to. Chapter 12. The Language of Light. The day the gallery spotlight fell on Ethan's childhood drawings, something changed not just in the space, but in the people who entered it. Visitors paused longer in front of the new installation. Some read the letter once. Others read it silently to themselves and then whispered it to the person beside them. A few wiped their eyes. Not because they knew Ethan, but because they recognized the language it spoke. It wasn't just about art anymore. It was about reconciliation. About how love, even delayed, still counted if it arrived at all. Ethan stood in a corner of the room, arms folded, watching it happen. He no longer hovered near his paintings, explaining color choices or composition to curious onlookers. Instead, he stood back, letting the work speak, letting the silence breathe. His father stood beside him more often now. They didn't talk constantly, but the stillness between them was no longer heavy. It had become spacious, comfortable even, like a room with open windows. That evening, Ethan brought Richard to the rooftop studio of the school, a place he hadn't shared with anyone else, not even Jamie. The sun was setting, washing the city in soft gold and lavender. The rooftops of Paris stretched out in layers of blue-gray, and the horizon burned with warmth. This is where I go to breathe, Ethan said, opening the door. To start again. Richard stepped inside and turned slowly. The space was modest, half-finished canvases, scattered brushes, walls stained with pigment and fingerprints, but it was full of something else too. Light. Even at dusk, the room shimmered. Richard walked toward the largest canvas in the room. It was different from the gallery work, brighter, more open. A figure stood in the center, arms outstretched, half-formed. On the edges, another figure was taking shape, reaching toward the center, but not yet touching. He pointed at the canvas. This one's not done. Ethan nodded. It's still becoming. Who is it? I think, Ethan said slowly, it's us. But not quite yet. Richard looked at his son and smiled, small, tight, but real. Then let me know when I can be part of finishing it. They sat side by side on the windowsill afterward, sipping lukewarm tea Ethan had forgotten he brewed. You know, Richard said quietly, your grandfather once told me that silence was stronger than words. That men proved love through work, not sentiment. Ethan stared ahead at the skyline. Do you still believe that? Richard hesitated. I used to. Until I realized I mistook fear for strength. And silence for safety. Ethan turned toward him. And now? Now I think love should make noise. Even if it's awkward. Even if it comes late. Ethan smiled. That's the language of light, Dad. Richard blinked. What is? The way it shows up quietly, but everywhere. You don't always see it right away. But it's there. And when it hits the right spot, even shadows begin to speak. They stayed there until the sun dipped below the buildings and the studio went dark except for the city's flickering lights. And in that silence, not of absence, but presence, they found something neither had expected. Peace. The next day, Richard did something he hadn't done since his youth. He picked up a paintbrush. It was clumsy at first, his grip awkward, strokes too heavy. But Ethan didn't laugh. He guided his father's hand slowly, showing him how to blend, how to hold breath in motion. They didn't speak much. But side by side, they added to the unfinished canvas from the night before. Line by line. Color by color. Two figures. Not complete. But no longer alone. Chapter 13. What belongs in a name? The week after the exhibit closed, Ethan stood in front of the gallery's glass doors with a key in his hand. It felt ceremonial somehow, locking up after the final day. As if he were sealing something sacred, something that would echo long after the last guest had left. Jamie was already down the street, waving at the cab, her bag slung over one shoulder and a baguette in the other like a true Parisian. Richard stood a few feet away, hands in the pockets of his wool coat, watching his son. You want to say something? Ethan asked, smiling. I'm just wondering, Richard said, if you've ever thought of putting your name on a building. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You mean like Carter and Son? No, Richard replied. I mean, yours. Just yours. A gallery. A space. Something of your own. Ethan looked away toward the glass reflecting the faded gold of the Paris afternoon. I think, for a long time, I didn't think my name meant much. Not unless it came with yours. Richard's throat tightened. I didn't mean for that. I know, Ethan said softly. But I had to leave to figure it out. They stood in silence for a beat. Then Richard added, I've been thinking of stepping back. Letting the firm go. Retiring. Ethan blinked. Really? Yes, he said. I've spent so long building for the sake of legacy that I forgot to live in it. And now that I've seen what legacy actually looks like, your work, I realize I'd rather sit in a studio with a brush in my hand than a spreadsheet. Ethan laughed. I can't imagine you in a smock. Let's not get carried away. They smiled. That evening, back at the apartment, Jamie sat cross-legged on the floor, organizing flyers and messages from buyers and critics. You've got 3 offers for interviews, 2 commission requests, and 1 artist in New York who wants to collaborate. Ethan leaned against the counter. All because of a few drawings from when I was 7. Jamie looked up. Not just because of those drawings. Because you finally stopped hiding. And because your story let other people find pieces of their own in it. She paused. You gonna stay here in Paris? He hesitated. Then looked toward his father, who was sitting at the window with a sketch pad, yes, an actual sketch pad, in his lap. I think I'm going home. Jamie blinked. Boston. Home is wherever I can paint without erasing who I am. He smiled. So yeah, Boston. 2 months later, the sign went up in Beacon Hill. Not large. Not fancy. Just a modest storefront painted in pale gray blue, with the words in clean serif lettering. The Carter Gallery. Underneath, in smaller font. Where stories become color. Inside, the walls were hung with a mix of Ethan's pieces and new works from emerging artists. Every Friday, they held workshops for kids. Every Sunday, they hosted silent viewings, an hour where phones were turned off, conversations paused, and people simply looked. Richard showed up every week. Sometimes to help. Sometimes just to sit quietly with a pencil and draw. They even finished the painting together. The one from Paris. It hung behind the front desk. Two figures. No longer reaching. No longer turning away. But standing together. One morning, as Ethan was rearranging pieces for a new exhibit, he caught his reflection in the gallery window. Behind him. His father was teaching a little girl how to hold a brush, her curls bouncing as she nodded furiously at his instructions. For a long time, Ethan had felt like his name only mattered in his father's shadow. Now it lived in the light. And this space, this story, this family rebuilt by choice and forgiveness, was the kind of legacy that didn't need blueprints. Just courage. And color. Chapter 14, A Quiet Kind of Pride. The Carter Gallery had been open for 6 weeks when the letter arrived. It came in a plain envelope, no return address. The handwriting on the front slightly uneven, like someone who hadn't written by hand in years. Ethan had been sorting through a shipment of new canvases in the back room when Jamie brought it to him. "This one looks personal," she said, tossing it gently onto the table. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Dear Ethan, I visited the gallery last Tuesday. You weren't there. That was probably for the best. I'm not sure I would have had the nerve to speak to you in person. But I saw everything. I saw the painting of the two figures, yours and his. I stood in front of it for 10 minutes, and I swear I could feel them breathing. I don't know if you remember me. We were in school together. I used to joke that art was for people who couldn't handle real work. I'm writing to say I was wrong. What you created in that space, it moved something in me. Not just your art. Your honesty. I took my father there yesterday. He's 72 and has never cried in public. But he did when he read your father's letter. Thank you for speaking what so many of us couldn't say. Ethan read the letter twice, then folded it gently and placed it in the drawer where he kept small notes from gallery visitors, postcards, sketches, thank yous. But this one, he knew, would stay with him longest. Because it wasn't just a compliment. It was a reminder that art doesn't shout. It whispers. And in the quiet, it heals. Later that afternoon, Richard arrived for his usual Thursday visit. He wore a faded navy sweater Ethan had never seen before and carried a small canvas under his arm. New masterpiece? Ethan asked, grinning. Richard raised an eyebrow. Be careful. It might end up being better than yours. They walked to the workshop room together, where a handful of local kids waited with paint-stained smocks and wide eyes. Richard had become their favorite, Mr. Carter the Builder, they called him, not realizing the irony. That day, the lesson was about painting shadows. Ethan watched as his father knelt beside one small boy who couldn't get the shading quite right. Instead of correcting him, Richard held up the child's painting and said, "Do you see how your shadow curves? That's your story bending. That's not a mistake, it's movement." The boy's eyes lit up. Ethan stood in the doorway, arms folded, a soft ache blooming in his chest. Once, that was all he had wanted from his father, to see the curves as movement, not error. To know that a crooked line could still be beautiful. And now here he was, giving that gift to others. That evening, they stayed late at the gallery, cleaning brushes in silence. Jamie had gone home early. The kids long since collected by their parents. The only light came from the wall sconces casting gold across the studio floor. Richard finally spoke. You remember that first drawing you made me? The one of us holding hands. Ethan smiled. The one where your hands were just rectangles? That's the one. I was 6. I kept it in my desk drawer. Every time I felt like I didn't know what I was doing as a father, I looked at it and thought, well, at least he thinks I'm worth drawing. Ethan looked up. You never told me that. Richard shrugged. I didn't know how. You do now. There was a long pause. Then Richard said, You ever think we're both still learning how to be seen? Ethan nodded. Maybe that's what all this is. Not finishing a story, just learning to tell it out loud. Richard smiled. Then let's keep telling it. As they locked up for the night, Ethan paused at the front window. His name was still there. The Carter Gallery. But it felt different now. Not a burden. Not a monument. Just a place. A home. A name that no longer tried to prove something. Just one that quietly held what mattered. Behind him, his father reached for the light switch. Ethan turned to him and said, "Leave it on." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Ethan looked out toward the street. The dark. The people passing by. "Because someone might need to know we're still here." Chapter 15. Of all the things we carry. Ethan stood at the airport gate with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a rolled-up canvas in his hand. Not a painting, just blank linen stretched tight. The edges frayed slightly where he'd trimmed it himself. The kind of canvas that held promise more than product. The kind that whispered, "Begin again." He was headed to New York. Not to move, just for a week. A gallery had invited him to do a workshop and feature 3 pieces in a modern narrative series about family, grief, and identity. But somehow, the weight of the moment made it feel bigger than it was. Like standing on a bridge between 2 versions of himself. The boy who left Boston in silence. And the man who now left with a father's voice behind him saying, "Call me when you land." At the Carter Gallery, Richard stood in the workshop room adjusting the easels. A group of high school students would arrive in 20 minutes for the first session of the new youth art program, one Ethan had designed and Richard had organized. He still wore his old watch. Still tucked his shirts too neatly into his slacks. But his hands moved differently now, not with urgency but care. Deliberation. He was learning to measure time not by deadlines, but by presence. Margaret called just after noon. They spoke longer these days. Laughed more. Sometimes they argued about little things like grocery brands or his questionable attempts at gardening behind the gallery. But always, the conversation circled back to Ethan. "He sent me a photo from the airport," she said. "He looks full." Richard smiled faintly. "He is. Proud. More than I have words for." There was a pause. "You going to tell him that someday?" "I'm going to keep showing him." Ethan arrived in Manhattan just as the sky cracked open with an early spring rain. By the time he reached the gallery, his hair was damp and his shoes made soft squishing sounds against the polished floors. Still, when the curator greeted him, she smiled as though he were royalty. "You brought it?" she asked, pointing to the canvas tube. Ethan nodded. "Not painted yet." "Even better," she grinned. "You'll make it here." That evening, alone in the temporary studio space, Ethan pinned the blank canvas to the wall and stood back. He didn't rush, didn't outline. He just stood there, brush in hand, and breathed. Then, in the center of the white field, he made the first stroke. It was not loud, not bold. It was a curve. Gentle, quiet, the shape of someone turning, not away, but toward. In Boston, after closing up the Carter Gallery for the night, Richard sat in the back office and opened the drawer Ethan had built into the desk for him. Inside, he kept only 3 things. A photo of the 2 of them standing under the Paris skylight. One of Ethan's earliest drawings rescued from the box and framed in thin walnut wood. And a letter. The first Ethan ever sent him. He read it again, even though he knew the words by heart. "I'm not writing for an apology. I'm writing because every color I use still has your voice in the background, telling me it's not enough. I've painted you in shadows, in storms, in silence. Maybe someday I'll learn how to paint forgiveness." He folded it slowly, then whispered, not to the letter, but to the memory of his son as a boy. "I think you already have." Later that week, Ethan sent a package from New York. It arrived at the gallery with no return label, just Richard's name written in bold across the front. Inside was a painting, not of Richard, not of Ethan, but of a child, genderless, faceless, holding a paintbrush in one hand and a small wooden box in the other. The child stood in a room filled with light. And the title? Heirloom. Chapter 16. The Gallery After Dark. The Carter Gallery was closed for the night. Outside, the street lamps flickered against the soft drizzle of early spring. Inside, The space was bathed in low amber light, the kind that made every frame on the wall glow just enough to feel alive. Richard stood alone in the center of the gallery, his hands in his coat pockets, quietly staring at the newest piece. Heirloom. The child in the painting seemed to hold both wonder and weight. The paintbrush pointed slightly downward, as if resting after a long day, while the wooden box in the other hand was cradled like a sacred thing. The light in the painting came not from the top or the side, but from within. It spilled from the center. From the child. Richard had seen many things in his life: buildings rise, fortunes grow, plans executed with ruthless precision. But this painting? This was the first time he felt like something had seen him back. He sat down on the bench in the middle of the room. Behind him, the soft echo of the grandfather clock Ethan had moved into the gallery ticked through the quiet. It had once stood in the foyer of their home, a constant presence through silent dinners and unspoken tension. Now, its sound felt comforting, like forgiveness keeping time. Margaret arrived a few minutes later, coat damp from the rain. She stepped into the gallery and paused, wiping her feet carefully before looking up. "I thought I'd find you here," she said. Richard offered a tired smile. "I was just sitting with it." Margaret walked over and stood beside him, her eyes scanning the painting. "He's in there. Every version of him." Richard nodded. "And every version of me I wish I'd been sooner." She looked at him gently. "You got here. That's what matters." He leaned back slightly. "You know, for years I believed a legacy was something you built with concrete. I thought it had to be strong, permanent, unbreakable. And now? I think the best kind of legacy," he said, "is something soft enough to be passed down, but strong enough to survive being misunderstood." They turned as the door creaked open again. Ethan stepped inside, reins still in his hair, a bag slung across his back. He wasn't due back from New York until the next day, but here he was, quiet as ever, eyes landing on them with a calm warmth. "You didn't tell us you were coming early," Margaret said, smiling. "Couldn't sleep," he replied. "And I missed home." Richard stood. "You're home now." They stood there, all three of them, facing the painting. Then Ethan said, "I want to add one more piece before the next exhibit." Richard raised a brow. "Another painting?" "No," Ethan said. He pulled something from his bag. It was the wooden box. The original. The one his father had brought to Paris. Inside, the drawings remained, now wrapped in tissue, weathered but intact. "I want to display it," he said. "Not in a case. Open. So people can touch the pages. So they know how legacy really looks, creased and messy and full of love." Richard swallowed hard. "Are you sure?" Margaret asked. Ethan nodded. "It's not mine anymore. It belongs to everyone who's ever needed to hear that they were enough, even if it came too late." They placed the box beneath Heirloom that night, on a low wooden pedestal with a single line engraved on the plaque. "The art we carry is the love we couldn't say." Later, after Margaret went home, Richard and Ethan sat on the bench once more, side by side. "You know," Richard said quietly, "when you were born, I was terrified." Ethan glanced over. "I didn't know how to be anything but a provider," Richard continued. "I thought if I built enough, earned enough, you'd never feel small. But all you really needed was for me to kneel down and see the world from your height." Ethan smiled gently. "You're doing that now." Richard looked around the room. "I didn't think I'd end up in an art gallery at the end of my career." "You didn't," Ethan said. "You ended up in mine." Outside, the rain had stopped. And inside, the Carter Gallery remained lit long after the city had gone to sleep, one window glowing soft against the night, like a lighthouse for the heart. Not because anyone forgot to turn the lights off, but because someone somewhere might still be walking toward it. And in that place, they would find not silence, but color, and story, and home.